Greetings. I'm sorry. It's just one of those things. I've never missed classes. I've never had to reschedule things, but I think it's just as my friends and I were talking, it's the time of life when I'm, like I said, I'm 65 and I'll be 66 in August. And I still think I'm in my 20s mentally or my 30s, but just things are coming down around you and you just have to keep your head up, just keep going. So I wanted to go ahead because I'll be leaving in the morning for North Carolina. I will be there for a while, but I will be doing class from North Carolina, not tomorrow night, but definitely Wednesday and Thursday night. We're going to do the mock exams. I'm going to go ahead and go over the remainder of what I had for the Azure tools for security. I'm going to get into compliance. You've already submitted, you'll be submitting tomorrow lesson 5 and then lesson 6. Yeah. And that's on the service license, licensure agreements, or the pricing, which we've kind of gone over. And I'm going to go ahead and I'll post in the dashboard the links again to the agreements and the service license agreements and the pricing again, depending on the need of that entity or that enterprise. But for now, I want to finish up with the tools for Azure. I went over basic networking tools and things we do, but now using Azure tools. And then the compliance part of it, a little bit of laws and regulations. And just as a reminder about Active Directory and role-based, the principle of least privilege, which has to do with only allowing somebody access to the job they need to complete. Usually we go, most of the time for me and my job, I always did role-based. As I said, we used to have different departments and people had names attached to the devices in their areas. And I took that away because it didn't make sense to use a person's name because people come and go. So it should really go by the department or the role that entity is, whoever has that position. And I mentioned about senior biologists and things like that in faculty. So only giving those roles or those with authorization and access to complete their task, to complete the job they need to do. And you can elevate those privileges. We call it privilege bracketing or elevation. When there is, say, a project, they might be working with others on a project, or if somebody, I'll give you an example before I go back to this. We had 2 people in the front office for administration at UF. Others were doing other things, and one did payroll and accounts receivable, and the other did accounts paying and all kinds of other stuff, taking care of the lease lines for AT&T and that nifty stuff. So when Dale would go on vacation, I would have to elevate Melissa's authorization and access so that she could do the payroll, because we all still wanted to get paid while Dale was off having a good time. Okay, so there are times when that's going to occur, and you have to look at what is it that person needs to do, how long of a duration is it going to be, and not to forget to put them back. A lot of times what happens in misconfiguration or not paying attention to your security settings and protocols and processes is people will set things up, but they forget to rescind those privileges and authorization and access. And that's not to say that the person who's been elevated to those tasks is doing anything bad, but the ones that are listening outside are looking for a way in, especially when these folks here aren't paying attention or might be doing something that leaves them vulnerable, is what I'm trying to say. Okay, so the second tool, if you'll remember when we went over the first, there's 6 primary tools for, we had about sign-on, multi-factor, user risk, and sign-on. Okay, so these are the top 6, just as a review, and they're listed here. So we went over Azure Active Directory Identity Protection. We went over Azure Firewall. We're looking at resource locks and so on. We're going to be getting down to Key Vault and then multi-factor for Active Directory. So number 1 was the Active Directory Identity Protection, and I went over that last Thursday. And that pertains to multi-factor. It pertains to user risk and having conditional access policies. Looking at how risky is it with these folks. And we watched a video on, and then sign on, the person sign on using Active Directory. Because remember, Active Directory is like having your phone book, locating who it is, where their location is, and their associated IP addressing. So now we're looking at firewalls, and you have to forgive me because I'm just really thirsty. Okay. So the key features of the Azure firewall, that is cloud native. It provides network and application traffic filter. Remember, I talked about, as information and data traverses the network, it's being monitored. It's always being monitored, or it should be. So we're looking at how do we filter the traffic that could have an anomaly of some type. If it's already recognized in the signature base, as we mentioned, and an anomaly base, but we're always trying to figure out filtering the traffic to make sure it's going to the destination it's supposed to, and that what's in those data packets is actually good stuff. We don't want the bad stuff traversing through our network. It's also there to look for threat intelligence, to alert in case there is any malicious traffic. It has built-in high availability, and it's seamless when we integrate it with other Azure services. So if you had other services you signed up for, that you're paying for Azure, it will integrate and very well with the others. It'll play nicely with the others. It's very simple to use. It takes only a few minutes. We use it automatic deployment, zero maintenance, which is why a lot of people like using Azure. And there is a central management via a management system for the firewall. So you'll have Azure Firewall Manager. It's very cost effective, and it's designed to deliver essential cost effectiveness for firewall protection for your resources. Because remember, we've been creating a lot of resources and manipulating them in such a way on our network to do what we want it to do within our virtual network. So firewalls are extremely important, and you can have many besides Azure. You can have many firewalls within your network. Azure is just, again, a tool. So this kind of gives you an idea of our virtual networks, right? We have our user configuration set up. We've got our known malicious IPs and threat intelligence set up. We've got the basic firewall set up, right? And our central virtual network. And looking at the on-premise traffic, this is on premises. And these are folks here off-site, right? And then these are people, threat intel, network address translation, network and application traffic filtering, rules that allow inbound and outbound access. So if something is not within compliancy of that rule, then it doesn't get in. It shouldn't be getting in. And that's the purpose of this, is to protect the network from those outside that we do not know. And we don't know what they're doing to protect their networks. So the idea is it's our job to protect our own. So as this circulates through to whoever is on our virtual network, whether it's virtual network 1, virtual network 2, how many we have, that this firewall is protecting anything coming in from the outside, traversing through it, it's being filtered, then is utilized in and out of the devices that we are using on our virtual network. That's the job. It's supposed to be impenetrable. Doesn't mean it never happens, but we're trying to put up a wall, a deterrent, our first line of protection. The third tool is Azure Resource Locks. Azure Resource Locks. So as the administrator, okay, you can lock an Azure subscription, a resource group, a resource to protect them from accidental deletions or modifications that users do. I gave you examples of peer-to-peer, which is why I don't like doing peer-to-peer, is people having access to a central file on someone's computer that acts as the main peer grouping, like for a printer, shared files and resources. Not a good idea, because I'm not saying people are manipulative or malicious all the time. Sometimes we accidentally do things, and unless you're backing things up, it can be problematic. So here we have that capability to protect ourselves from that occurring. The lock will override any user's permission. So it doesn't matter what the user has. If we need to, on that lock, we can override whoever has a permission. And you can set locks that will prevent either those deletions or modifications. And in the portal, those locks are called delete or read only. Just like sometimes when we do a Word document, if we don't want somebody to be able to modify it in any way, we create it as a read only, meaning they would have to copy and paste it and work within their document. It's only a read only. They can't do anything to it or manipulate it in any way. And here we have an overview of a resource group called Example Group. Okay. And what we're doing here is we are looking at Databricks, and we are looking at, okay, subscription is called third internal consumption. And if we need to, then we have the capability, looking at policies and deployment and so on, we can do these resource locks for these Databricks and overriding any permissions for any of those users just to prevent any kind of deletions or modifications. And that's what we can do. And that's in this section here that you see an overview of an example of a resource group in Databricks. Now, the fourth one is called Azure Always Encrypted. We want to always make sure that what we're doing in data is always encrypted. It's always gone from plain text to ciphertext, that it's always, or hashed, or whatever we have to do in order to protect that information so that somebody else can't see what it is. So you can, in Azure AD, you can do always encrypted. It's a feature designed to protect very sensitive data. This is where you really want to be concerned about sensitive data, such as your credit card numbers, national and regional identification numbers, Social Security numbers, for example, stored in Azure SQL's database or Azure SQL managed instance or SQL Server databases. So this always has to do with the database and information. And we have a number of them. A lot of companies, yes, they do. They have credit cards, they have numbers associated with accounts and so on. So you want to make sure that that information is always protected. So an example here is we see a database client in plain text that's being sent along, and it gets encrypted with the SQL client driver. Okay, becoming that ciphertext as it keeps moving along till it gets to the database engine, or what we call the dynamic link library of SQL, and it stays encapsulated, so that until it is given permission to be opened by wherever it's going, it then goes to plain text. So it starts off plain text, gets encrypted, and it stays encrypted until there's access to it. And so it's the same thing here when we look at a database. And SQL is where we do our querying for our databases in relational databases. So this gives you the example of what it would look like. Then the fifth thing is, and that's what we just did in Lab 4, which I did post 2 of them. I'm going to do the third one in a while. I'm trying to do things as I'm packing and trying to get stuff done for my dad. Anyway, we were going over Azure Key Vault. Now I know you've done it, but I'm going to explain it. And they have the lessons in there, and it tells you why you're doing what you're doing. But the Azure Key Vault is a cloud service that provides secure storage for any secret or sensitive information. So you can securely store keys, your passwords, certificates, or any other secrets that the enterprise might have. Azure Key Vaults are created and managed through, again, Azure, the portal. And in this gives you an idea of a quick start. You can create a key vault and then use it to store a secret, whatever information it is that you want to keep from the public eyeballs or anybody else's. So we see here an encryption key hierarchy. This is traditional. This is how it works traditionally. And then looking at it with Azure. So we start off with our database, and we've got what's called a SQL Server certificate. Then we go from this tradition of the certificate, double checking it through the SQL Server instance, and then going to the user database encryption key. Remember, I talked about public and private keys. You have, when we're talking to servers, using a session key. So the idea is you have to have some way to encrypt using keys, be able to talk to each other, sending it along, encrypting it with a public key or a certificate of some type. And when it gets to the other end, you have to have the ability to decrypt it, meaning you have to have some type of format, something, in order to unlock it and open it and then look at it and get what you need from it. Now, when we look at Azure, Azure has its own asymmetric key. So with the asymmetric key, it's already set up in the Key Vault. And then you go to the SQL Server to connect. And then from that, we still use the SQL Server instance and the master database, not the user database, but the master database is here. We start off with the master in tradition, going to the user. Here we're starting off with the key vault and going to the master database. And we would still be using what is called the database encryption key. If we don't have that key, we will not be able to unlock that information. We have to be able to communicate between the two. With an asymmetric key, you have the private keys that are pre-shared. They are private keys that are pre-shared. So that's what asymmetric actually means. And then symmetric. All right, moving on. Then the last tool we have is the Azure Active Directory multi-factor authentication. Now, we all tend to use this. I know we use it at my work, but we also use, like I said, Cisco's Duo. So with this, with Active Directory, it gives us the safeguard to access our data and applications, resources that we want to use, providing then that another layer of security by using a second form of authentication, not just relying on one form of authentication. So organizations can enable multi-factor with, as I showed you earlier, conditional access to make the solution customized to your needs. It's going to be customized to your needs. So here we see we've got apps, our apps and data. We verify every access attempt, because you will, and the signals for it. We've got user location, we've got an application, we've got real-time risk, we've got different devices, but we've got this key that we need to have, this key. And by doing so, we either, if the key has been checked out and it is okay, then you get access to the applications and the data. If we find that the multi-factor authentication that you're trying to provide does not match, then you will not be going anywhere. You will be blocked. And that's the purpose of multi-factor, not just having one thing to identify who I say that I am. I can say who I am, but then I have to provide, how do I prove who I say that I am? So then you want to use that multi-factor in order to do that. So those are the 6 tools that we would use from Azure. Now, getting into compliance. I have a presentation there, and I will have probably some videos in here that you will need to go back and look at if you choose to. These are things I use for my classes in general, for my security classes. So let's get into a little bit about compliance. So laws and regulations, there are many. They stand for rules, standards, reviews, codes, procedures, audits, guidelines, and it all leads to being compliant and showing that you are being compliant if you get audited. Now, we have different US laws, but laws that are important to general students. If you haven't heard of FERPA, or if you have children, it's important to you because FERPA is important to them. The idea is, this is called the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. This law protects the privacy of a student education record. This applies to all schools, no matter who receive funds under an applicable program of the U.S. Department of Education. Now, if they're not getting any funding, then it doesn't apply to them as far as private schools and so on. They have their own rules and protocols set in place. But for the general purpose, when we talk about public, is anything that any school across the United States who receives funds in order to do what they need to do in their school environment, then this is applicable to them. Meaning, if I've had parents come to Santa Fe College when I was still there, wanting to talk about their child who was 18. I could not speak to them unless the 18-year-old gives permission. And if you go onto a website for a standard college or university, if you go to student services, you'll see that there is a form there that has to be completed by the person, by that student, authorizing who has access to their information. If their parents aren't on it, we as faculty are not permitted to give out information. Staff are not permitted. Nobody is, unless it's written, because you could get sued. So the idea is you have to have permissions. Now, anybody underage, you're still a child, then considered a child, and the parent still has the right over the child. So they could ask for that information. Just depends. But we can't randomly share even if this person's under 18. We can't randomly share anybody's information, no matter who it is. Under 18, over 18, it doesn't matter. Unless they give permission to say everybody can have access to my files. And that doesn't usually happen. So FERPA is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. You should be familiar with that. And I have a video on that too. I've had it where students have worked together on a project and they said, well, can't I just tell so-and-so because he's my roommate? No, I can't. Doesn't matter if he's your roommate. Doesn't matter if he told you verbally, hey, even if I hear him on a phone, okay? Even if I hear a student on the phone say, hey, no, it's okay, blah, blah, blah. I can tell him over the phone, but I can't tell his roommate. Otherwise, I could be in a lot of trouble. Doesn't matter that he's telling me. We have to have written in ink or digitally signed authorization. Now, the other one here that should be familiar with if you're not is HIPAA. Pretty sure all of you have heard of HIPAA at some point. And that is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Again, this is to protect your health information. We don't disclose the information. Okay, so any company that deals with PHI has to ensure that all the required physical network and process security measures are in place and adhered to. And I mean adhere to, because they have compliance. We have to provide reports that we are compliant with the rules and regulations of our state and of our college and of our board. So that's what we do at our colleges, but you have to be. And in health, you can't be just sharing people's information. It's private. Unless, again, they've given consent. And I'm pretty sure if you've been to the doctor or dentist more recently, you've seen, and they always give you the clipboard or the digital thing, the digital iPad. Have you updated your address, or did your insurance change or whatever? But you always have to sign these compliance forms for HIPAA, no matter how many times you've been there. It's a requirement. And I have a video on that. Now, the Patriot Act is interesting because sometimes some of my students don't know what the Patriot Act is. It came about from 9/11, one of the worst days in our history. There are a few others I can think of, but one of the worst days. I remember exactly where I was when the World Trade Center got hit. And it was born from that. And it still is, it goes through so many cycles that it gets voted on. Should we continue? Should we continue? Yes, we continue. And that was for surveillance of terrorism. Now, people get upset about privacy. We talk about privacy. Privacy, guys, in my opinion, is just an illusion. As long as you're not hurting anybody and you're obeying the laws to the best of your ability, you're pretty much not going to have a problem. But if you start doing things that you shouldn't be doing and associating with people that maybe are, questionable, then you might be surveilled. But the idea is they're not really looking for you unless you're doing something. And even when they're scoping an area and you're caught in the net of it in conversation, because they're listening, unless you're doing something or keywords that they're listening for, and they're not just waiting for you to say, oh, bomb. I just said bomb. They're not waiting for you just to say it once or twice. They're looking for people in general that are in cells or could be somebody to watch for a while and see if there's something going on. So there is a video on the National Security Agency and the Patriot Act. Now, by the U.S. Justice Department from 2015, and it still applies today, the consideration of federal privacy is from 1974, which establishes a code of fair information practices that governs the collection, maintenance, use, and dissemination of information about individuals that is maintained in systems of records by federal agencies. A system of records is a group of records from which they can derive your information. So something identifiable to you, your name, your address, your social security number, your work number, anything that's retrieved under your name as some type of identifier that's assigned to you. Okay, so they do keep records. Now, this one I love because you definitely want to watch this. We are always data mined. Pretty much every minute of the day, we go on our computers, we do stuff, we watch TV, with smart TVs, you go on your phone, anything. But this always scares people when I show this to them. And I'm not trying to make anybody paranoid, but you'd be surprised just from one search where it all leads. And in your day, It's not about just sitting in your home on your computer. It's everywhere you go. Who has access to it? Who has access to your data? So you want to watch that. So let's get into compliance itself, security compliance. Again, we have to have regulations. We have to be responsible. There's got to be some type of system. We have to have a way to control and regulate. There has to be standards. We have to be looking at being transparent, all of this. And the reason this came about, and I have videos on what compliance actually is, so please look at these. But it came about especially back in the mid-90s with Enron and Tyco and Health South and all of them, that because of finance, they were just raking money in hand over fist and screwing everybody out of money, and especially those in their pensions. So, security compliance. Assessing which rules and regulations will apply to an organization is not an easy feat. It's just not. So the best method to approach in a situation like this is you need to outline all of the regulations that will impact a company, number one. Then you need to determine what security controls you need to implement to satisfy all of those requirements and regulations effectively and efficiently. Sometimes you're going to have overlapping requirements built into different regulations. So by breaking them down into the two phases, companies can reduce the amount of time and money they thought or would otherwise spend by reducing the duplicate effort of implementing competing systems. So I have a video pertaining to IT security versus IT compliance. Now, the key elements of that compliance framework. You should always have a framework. We have a framework for everything. This here, the compliance policy, this will include the roles and responsibilities of those within the organization, any type of governing legislation. We have a board. We have a board of trustees at our colleges, all of the colleges I've worked at, university too. They're called, Board of Trustees for UF, Santa Fe College, and for Florida Gateway. Processes that we use to identify any new compliance obligations and relevant controls. There's always a compliance officer at these locations too. Compliance officers make tons of money. They make really good money because they have to be up to date with legalities, laws, regulations, processes, procedures. Oh man, yeah. I mean, they just do. They're really good at what they do. That's all they do, making sure that that organization stays within compliance so they don't get penalized. And then systems to manage compliance oversight. Things like this, like Azure or other, you have other tools. You're not just using one tool, you have different tools you can utilize to then distribute those and run those reports so that you have something that you can give and say, these are all the things we're doing to stay compliant in this organization. And then processes for internal and external testing and review. That's why pen testing, and David, I've mentioned before, you probably would be more interested in penetration testing, being a pen tester, making sure, trying to find out who the bad guys are, how they're trying to get in, what way are they getting in, sandboxing stuff, trapping them. So the idea here is you want to hire outside organizations to pen test or to look at the boundaries and look at your organization, how you're protecting the information of that organization. And then you have your internal group. Don't just be reliant on the internal group. It's best to have an outside group too. So you can say, we did this test internally and we did this with this external company called such and such. And this is what they did. And this was their report. And from that report, this is what we did to then plug the holes. Then you have a compliance plan, which will include a table summary of compliance obligations for each relevant legislation. It will also include risk of non-compliance, the obligation of the owner, associated controls, and review and attestation. Meaning you're always going to review. You don't just walk away and say, okay, we've got this implemented now. We don't need to do anything else or revise it at any point. Not true. Then you come down to the compliance register. This is a very granular listing of all relevant compliant obligations that you have and the risk of non-compliance, obligation of owner, associated controls, and reviewing it again. Now, the compliance calendar is very important, and I have had to do all of this when I was at UF. with the compliance calendar. It is the key compliance task. Sorry. The key compliance task to be completed on a routine basis each calendar year. I always had things, and that's why I love highlighters. I mean, I had things color coded. I would have when I knew certain things pertaining to whatever the regulations were, or auditing and reporting that had to be done certain times of year, I would have things set up, ready to go, and I would have all my paperwork ready, all my reports ready, and I would put them on the calendar so that I would know when it was coming to give myself time. And it may be limited to regulatory reporting activities or also internally driven compliance activities. So it's going to be dependent on the organization itself. But for us, we had certain times of the year we did certain things. And so I would always know and I'd be ready. So I had different walls with different boards on them and different things that I knew I was doing, which would make it much easier for me to follow, where I needed to be, time on task. But these are the key elements of a compliance framework. Now, compliance policy. What is a compliance policy? Roles and responsibilities, key pieces of legislation, processes for identification, systems or approaches that we're going to use to manage oversight. You have oversight committees for things. You have the same thing in an organization. And processes for internal, external testing. So the roles and responsibilities, you have a compliance management, which may be your board, your committees, your management, the compliance function, and all the staff. Key pieces of legislation that are going to govern the relevant compliance obligations that your organization has to meet. The processes for identification. You have to have a detailed summary of what it is that you're doing, that you are meeting those obligations, and incorporation of those relevant controls into the supporting framework that you have designated, that you've put together, such as privacy policy, complaints management policy. You have to have HR. You have to have a place for people to go and be able to provide complaints if they have to. Any breaches or incidents that may have occurred within your organization, you're supposed to report that. You're not supposed to wait. Some do, they'll wait before they actually have to say something. So very detailed documents on specific topics. And these were some of the examples I gave you. Now with the oversight, adherence to those compliance obligations, including any compliance attestations. You have got to adhere to those. That's why you have an oversight. And again, adherence to the compliance obligations, which you said you would do in your organization. And that's what the policy is. And then I also have a video pertaining to policies, compliance policies. Now, Enron was a horrible scandal. They were an energy company and went downhill, but the things that they did was horrible and made money hands over the fist. And the CEO, Kenneth Lay, said he didn't know. I understand that when you are in business and you are muckety mucks, okay, your CEOs, your CFOs, your chief financial officers, and so on. I get that you may not know every single little thing that goes on in the business, but you pretty darn well are told because you have management set up. That's what you have these managers for. That's why you have these meetings, so that you are told what's going on, that you are finding out. Because a CEO, in order to take the company further and take them higher and make more money, you have to know what's going on in your business. And there's no way this man didn't know. And again, cooking the books, making stock seem like it was higher than it was, making it more money than it was really valued at. And people lost pensions that worked for this company for years. It was horrible. And then, of course, WorldCom. WorldCom could have been the biggest communication company of the world. Okay, or definitely here, AT&T is one of the biggest. But WorldCom, again, cooking the books, making it seem like your stock is worth more than it is. And then Dennis Kozlowski from Tyco. What a pig. Sorry, but he was. And he is. He's still around. He started another company. You have to watch it. It's a $6,000 shower curtain. I mean, he spent so much money. He wasted so much money. And you know what got him? He to this day says that he made over 100, so I think 400 some odd $million. But he kept trying to say that he didn't do anything illegal. He didn't take money from the company illegally. And the person that could vouch for that is dead when he was going to court. What got him caught? His CFO, his chief financial officer, and him, what got them caught is that he got artwork. I mean, we're talking Renoirs, things like, major artwork. And he had a what is it, a townhouse in New York, really ritzy. And he had places all over, but he didn't want to pay tax. And I forgot, it was I think it was $13 million. And he didn't want to pay tax on $13 million. So he had it sent to New Hampshire, where there is no tax, and then driven to his townhouse in New York. And that's how he got caught, because he didn't want to pay tax on artwork that he purchased. And then you sit and listen to him. It's just disgusting how he says he didn't know about the $6,000 shower curtain or the $15,000 dog umbrella stand and all this crap inside the new townhouse. That was the interior decorator. He just signed the checks. I don't know about you, but if I'm paying $15,000 for a dog umbrella stand, I want to know what that looks like, because that must be some umbrella stand. And a $6,000 shower curtain. The video is older, so you can't really see it well, but it's crap. It's got gold inlay in it. It's crap. It's garish, very garish. Yeah, and this was a man, CEO of a company that he started off as an accountant making 28 grand, and then was leading. It's just disgusting. But anyway, and they use Gordon Gekko as an example. If you've never watched Wall Street, greed is good. No, greed is greed, and it will get you into trouble eventually. So these things, because of people like this and greed and nobody regulating them back then, that's where Sarbanes-Oxley came into play. Senator Sarbanes and Representative Oxley said, you know what? We've got to start holding these companies accountable. People have lost pensions. Ponzi schemes. Look at Bernie Madoff. Ponzi schemes. And look what happened to him. His son committed suicide. It's just a mess. Again, you have to have accountability. You have to follow laws, regulations, and rules. And back then, they decided, yes, we got to do something because we've let this run wild too long. So took care of that. So what is a compliance plan? Okay, it is a more detailed, I've given you the pyramid there, but a more detailed document, which is setting out the content of the compliance policy that we were talking about, as described above, but also includes a series of tables which summarize the key compliance obligations in each of the relevant pieces of legislation with which the organization must comply. Now, the tables in the compliance plan will also include the following: risk of noncompliance, obligation of the owner, associated control, and review and attestation frequency. So we keep going back to these 4 pillars. So here's an example, and this comes from HIPAA. Now, there's many different ones out there. Now, HIPAA, remember, we have to be concerned about health information. So we're looking at the gap identification and remediation. Our policies, what are we going to do? How do we eradicate or remediate things? The policies and procedures and the training we're going to put together and implement. The document version, employee attestation and tracking, getting our feedback for that. Business associate management, incident management. You have to have risk and incident response, incident management. And you must have on a regular basis audits. Security risk assessment. So SRA, security risk assessment, administrative and privacy. You have to follow, you have to have a plan. You cannot move forward without one. So you've got to have these things in place. And this is just one example. There's more of HIPAA, there's more of FERPA, but all of this is what we do when we talk about compliance. So the compliance register, what's a compliance register? Well, we're looking at the risk, right? So a compliance register, or what's called an obligations register, can support the implementation of a high-level compliance policy with a granular listing of all of the compliance obligations that are relevant to your organization. And these registers are typically far more detailed than the summary tables that we see in a compliance policy or a compliance plan. Again, back to the risk of noncompliance, obligation of owner, associated controls, and review and attestation frequency. So we see here when we look at the register, and this can apply to anything when we talk about risk, cause and effect. So the risk, when we look at this, okay, let me move this over just a little. When you look at the risk, you see, okay, what's the risk? All right, credential compromise, data leaks, mobile media data protection, cloud vendor network compromised. Okay, so these are the risk factors that we're going to look at. Then we look at, well, what could happen? What could be the cause? Well, for credential compromise, we see phishing emails. They just sent a bunch of emails out and somebody got hooked. With data leaks, personal internet usage on a work device can happen. Mobile media data protection, removable digital media that's not backed up. And last, cloud vendor network compromise. The vendor uses unencrypted cloud communication, maybe not using a VPN, maybe not using a secure socket shell. Maybe we're not doing a data protection plan like you did in lab 4, okay? You got to have things encrypted that traverses through the network into the outside world. The impact, well, if these occurred, how many hours does it take, do you think, to find it? 120 for this, 300 here, data leaks, 250 here, and 100. What's the likelihood? You have to measure what's the likelihood this could occur. Well, this is medium, this is low data leaks, this is high because we use a lot of mobile devices, and the vendor one is pretty low for cloud. The outcome, okay, loss of organizational accounts to bad actors, unauthorized access of our CUI, loss of data and company assets, and the CUI sent and received from vendor is compromised. That information, the cloud vendor, it's compromised. Our unencrypted cloud information. The risk, again, medium, high, and then low. The cost, again, 100 hours here, 50 hours there, 120 hours here, 50 hours there. And you have got to come up with, what are we doing to mitigate this or eradicate it? What are the ramifications? All right, so organizational emails come with phishing detection software. So now we're going to implement this. Restrict access to the web content unnecessary to function of the organization. So people shouldn't be going on the internet on the workplace device unless it has something to do with work. With the mobile media data protection, log and report on all mobile media who has access and their contents. I did not create this, so the spellings may be off, but I did not create this. This came from CyberSync. And then lastly, creation of encrypted cloud network for all the vendors. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking compliance. We're not just writing up little policies and, thinking, okay, this is what we need to implement and this is the plan. You then have to look at risk, of all the factors of risk within your organization. That's a lot to consider. That's why there's risk management and incident response teams. Now, the compliance calendar, as I mentioned, it's very key to the tasks that have to be completed on a routine basis. So you have specific dates during the calendar year that you will have to do certain things, and you need to adhere to that and not push it back. Don't push it back. So these are the frameworks you should be familiar with. The security standards, this grouping. So this is the IT security frameworks, IT security standards, and IT security regulations. COBIT, NIST, there's different ones for NIST. NIST you should know because they have so many. I've given it to you before when I think I posted it last week. NIST is our organization for the National Institute of Standards of Technology and Technology. So they have a lot of information on their site, but these are specific. If you go to NIST and type these in, these are specific to what I'm talking about here. Then you have the ISO 27000 series, the CIS controls, HITRUST is another. GDPR is for our global data protection. I like the way they lay theirs out compared to ours. And then there's COSO. So you should start getting familiar if you're planning to stay and stick within security. you should get familiar with these organizations and the information pertaining to them. And rules and standards. Information security compliance means that you are meeting the rules or the standards regarding the protection of the data and information within your organization. There will be a number of government, industry, and other regulations for any organization that determine the specific security requirements for data information. You have got to adhere to those. You have got to be able to provide that you are doing what you need to do in order to protect that information and your employees also, not just the information, but your employees as well. So you will have, again, a number of government, industry, and other regulations for an organization to determine security requirements. There's always a guideline. It's a beautiful thing. That's why when people do compliance, you should always follow, or an audit, follow the checklist. They give you what you need to do. You just have to follow the checklist. And as long as you go through and you've checked everything off and have everything that you need, you think, to supply, then you're not in any problem. But if you don't, and you can even get people outside to help you, you should. Payment card industry does. So you have PCI and what's called data security standards. PCI and DSS, they work hand in hand. They work in tandem. And they are the information security standard for organizations. They handle credit cards for all the major credit card schemes. So the PCI standard is mandated by card brands, but it's administered through and by the Payment Card Industry Security Standards Council. So there's the ones that are setting up what you would have to do if you were handling credit cards. So you'd have to follow their compliance rules, regulations, and policies. So PCI DSS, that's who they are. And it's through the Department of Commerce. So here you see they have their layers of defense. They build and maintain a secure network. There it is, firewall management, vendor default controls. They have protect card data. So you have your data protection and your data transmission encryption. Then you have maintaining vulnerability management, right? So we want to make sure we have antivirus controls. And yes, they don't just rely on Windows Defender, but then again, it's not just their personal computer. System and application security. Then we have implementing strong access control measures. So multi-factor, that's just one layer, but you have biometrics, you have role-based, you have many different forms that you can utilize for access. So data access, personal access, physical access. Then you have regularly monitoring and testing the networks. I told you, you're never going to stop monitoring. So data and network access controls, security testing. And then lastly, maintaining an information security policy. That way, everybody knows what everybody's supposed to be doing. We don't have to question, oh, what are we doing today with this? You have a policy. You have a checklist. You have standards that you go through and that you're maintaining. That's the whole point of all of this. So it's not just willy-nilly and trying to figure out what you're doing. You're being proactive and you have all these things in place. The mistakes that are made, failing to vet the auditor. Skipping the pre-audit assessment. You should never skip things. Go through with it. I know it's boring, tedious work, but if you do, then you're done. Starting without a pre-audit checklist. I want that checklist. Poor documentation, meaning you should be keeping documentation. I had it for mine, for my audits where I was at UF, so I was ready. Bad assumptions. Data is everywhere. Ineffective data scoping and network segmentation. Looking for product panaceas, trusting just any old service provider and expecting to finish. You never really finish, but you do get you did a good job and you start it all over again until you leave the business. Then you don't have to worry about it. And I have a video on InfoSafe as an example. And then the top cybersecurity threats of 2022. I don't have them for 2023 yet, but these were the top cybersecurity threats I thought you might find interesting. And I threw in here a beginner's guide to NIST, the cybersecurity framework of NIST. So this is a really good video to help you. And when we look at standards, again, I'm going back over these. I've given them to you to understand who they are. These are your standards organizations. These are the acts. Here they are, what they regulate, and the companies that are affected. So take your time, go back over these, and remember, you'll have my presentations throughout the entire term of our class between the AZ 900 and the test out until the end of the term. Then you won't have access. But all of these are the groups that come up with the standards, and these are who we follow. Okay. And then if you want more information regarding Active Directory, you can continue going into there about Active Directory Federation services. As a matter of fact, I'm going to go ahead and go through that now. I know it's a little bit long. This is a web service. Remember, again, it's a web service because what we're doing is through the internet. It's a web service and is a feature in Windows Server operating systems for Windows Server that allows you to share identity information outside a company's network. The Active Directory, remember what I said about who your employees are. It authenticates the users with their username and passwords, and users can access specific applications without being prompted to provide login credentials repeatedly, because you're setting up what their permissions are going to be. So you don't have to keep going here, there, and yonder if you need to get to this resource or this resource, because you could be working on 3 different projects, and you can be working in your company or outside remotely with somebody else at another site. So this is a federation service that makes it so much easier, and we're doing it via web-based. So the components of the Active Directory Federated Services Server, the 4 major areas. We have Active Directory. This is where the identity of the information is stored. The Federation Server, it contains the tools that are required to route the requests that come in from those external users and their devices. And the Federation Proxy Server, it hosts the Federation Proxy Server role service of the ADFS. And this is done since the Federation Server is not exposed. We don't want it seen, it's private, to the internet, which heavily depends on the Active Directory. So the proxy server forwards that request from the outer world then to the Federation Server, with the Federation Server being protected. And the ADFS web server manages the security tokens and authentication cookies that are sent to the web server to authenticate the external user. It's a very good tool. The limitations, there's always going to be a downside to stuff. There are certain downsides, as we know, when we look at infrastructure. It does not allow access to share files or print servers. It does not allow Active Directory resources. It does not authenticate older web applications, and it does not allow connection to users using a remote desktop. Although it's very straightforward, it can be very complex for those of us that are novices. So you must have the skills required in order to work in Federation. In the present culture, bring your own device, ADFS needs to have an AD domain account, which only works on a domain joined by those devices. So nobody's expecting you to walk out of here and be an Azure expert in all these different things. You would just be a basic entry level understanding, just foundational understanding. That's all you've got. You would not be walking into a job and be thrown into Azure. If you said, oh, I got a certificate. Okay, once they see what it is, they'll know that you have a basic understanding. Conceptually, you can do this, and theoretically, you've done the labs, but you would have to apply it in the real world, and you wouldn't be by yourself doing that. Now, single sign-on. How does single sign-on actually work? Have you ever noticed when you're logging in or a third-party website, an option comes in to either use Facebook or Google? I hate that. The moment you choose any of these 3, you magically enter that application, right? And the question is, how does that happen? There is no magic. It's just a single sign-on. All it is an authentication scheme. It helps the user sign into multiple applications just using one username, one password. Remember I told you Google's going to be using the passkeys. This technology exercises one set of credentials to access different websites and apps. So here we are, we see our customers and partners, single sign-on, using either Gmail, Salesforce, Slack, and more to application services. So we want to use one single sign-on to get to all these different things, right? So we can use whatever pops up. It's usually Gmail, it's usually Facebook and something else. I tend not to do anything. So let's go here first to the next one. The Security Assertion Markup Language, SAML. It's an open standard of your identity provider to pass authorization credentials to service providers, passing the authorization credentials to the service providers. In other words, you can use a single set of credentials to log into different websites, single sign-on. It always manages, it's easier to manage one login per user than having to have separate login credentials to email, to resource management, consumer resource management, Active Directory, and so on. You don't want to have all these different things. It drives me crazy. When I log into my college, I have to log in if I want to go to Canvas. If I want to go over to the main page of Florida Gateway, I've got to have my password and username for that one. It'd be easier if I could just log in to Gateway itself, Florida Gateway, and not have to worry about it and go wherever I want. And that's what we're talking about here. So what it does is this security assertion markup language, okay, is used for communication between the identity server or the identity provider and the service providers. The identity provider and the service providers. It's a bridge between the two. So it enables the ability of single sign-on, which means the same credentials can be reused to log into other service providers. And this is how it works. You start off with a user opening up their browser. Okay. They request access to a particular source, goes to the web app server, right? Web application service provider. Then SAML will generate an authorization request and gets redirected to Active Directory. The user gets authenticated. Then the Azure Active Directory SAML identity provider issues those tokens. And from there, goes back through the web browser up to returning a secure page to the user, right? Or redirects those tokens. I'm sorry, redirects the tokens. And then goes out to the web app server again, validates the token and responds. So we're going from our identity provider here from Azure, getting our token, going to the web browser, then redirecting the token, going back through the web app service provider, validating the response and token, returning the secure page to the user, and now has access. So we've authenticated and we're using a token in order to do this. Now we do it very quickly. We don't see it, but these are all the steps that it takes. Now, going back to, and I have a video on that, how does it work? It's passing information about the user, the attributes and logins of that user between the identity provider and the service provider. Each user logs in once, right? The service provider requests authorization and authentication from the identity provider. Since both the systems speak the same language, the user just needs to log in once. And each identity provider and service provider need to agree upon how the configuration is going to be set up for the SAML. Both ends need to have the exact same configuration for the authentication to work. And there's a video here that shows you how that works. And it's not very long. Now, what's the difference between ADFS and SAML? Okay, well, we see here, we've got open premises Active Directory, conditional access policy, device authentication, we've got multi-factor authentication, and so on. Right here, we see we've got our user devices. We enroll the device in what's called Intune. And in Intune, we go to the device mobile device management compliance. Right? And we can register these devices here in Active Directory by the user and devices. So we've got enroll into device using Intune, or we can use users and devices and register them with the Azure Active Directory. This has to go through Intune to a device management system compliance. Here we go directly to the Azure Active Directory, then to the Azure Active Directory Connect Drive with read and with write back, and then to the Open Active Directory premises that give us access to what we need to have access to. Here we've got to take a few more steps for SAML, whereas with ADFS we don't. So what does it do? It enables users to authenticate using on-premise credentials, and access in all resources in the cloud. And as a result, it has become important to have a highly available ADFS structure, meaning high availability at all times, to ensure access to resources both on-premise and in the cloud. Now, with Azure Active Directory, again, this is a cloud-based identity and access management solution. That's what this is. That's what Azure means, as opposed to just Microsoft Active Directory, which is on-premise. Azure makes it both. So it helps legacy applications, which are older computer systems, run in the clouds, with us otherwise would be incapable of being able to do this authentication method. So Active Directory is the backbone for Microsoft 365, the company's flagship Office productivity suite. It uses SAML, or what's called OpenID authentications, to connect these applications while also using group assignments, meaning dynamic groups, more detailed, to determine who can access what and when. It streamlines and assimilates comprehensive identity management capabilities like the device registration, self-service password management, auditing, and multi-factor authentication. I think, yeah. And then we're back to what is Azure. So that is the end. I know it's a lot that you've taken in this instance. I would sit and maybe break it up. I think I've been talking for an hour. I'm not sure. But I wanted to make sure I went through all of this. And as I said, I'm going to go back through, and it always logs me out after a certain period of time. I'm going to go back through my files and video channels. Okay, I've gone through this now. It's always weird. They have you do this stuff prior to me going over the stuff. But I'm going to go back through and I'm going to post again the Azure pricing list, which I've done already, and the service license, and then the life cycles. Life cycles, as you know, it's anything will end at a certain period of time. So you have to look at end of life and also the life cycle for things. So I'll make sure to post that for you. And then, as I promised, for Wednesday, because I'm going to do that now. I've done this, but I'm going to post this because I've already gone over some of this last week. I'll post this part in the dashboard with more information on that. And so we'll do Wednesday night from 6 to 7:30. We'll do the mock exam number 1. And then Thursday night, we'll do the mock exam number 2 to prepare you for Saturday. Okay. Now I will be checking my email. I'm not available tomorrow as I'll be with my dad at the hospital. So I will be checking my email though. And if there are any questions you have, because by the time I get back, I'm taking my laptop with me. I will be checking things. And if there's things I can explain better for you, please let me know. And I will get that. I will answer you. Okay. But I will be going to the hospital each day. But I'll be back in time for Wednesday and Thursday night. Okay. And then next week, we'll be starting test out the Network Pro to take you to the CompTIA Network Plus. All right, guys, thank you. And again, I'm here if you need me. All right, so I'll get this video ready.